My corrupt manager embezzled $500,000 from our company, and when the auditors came knocking, he worked with a toxic HR director to frame me for the missing money. They dragged me into a windowless room and tried to blackmail me into signing a fake confession to protect the company's image. But they had no idea I was the one who built the company's secure server, and I still had a backdoor to every single hidden financial file. I crashed the quarterly board meeting, exposed HR's cover-up directly to the CEO, and watched the FBI raid the office. Grab a coffee, because watching this corrupt HR department burn to the ground is absolute perfection. If you have ever worked in corporate information technology, you already know the golden rule of the server room: the people who hold the most power in a company are usually the ones who understand the least about how it actually works. I, 32M, have spent the last 7 years working as the lead systems architect for a mid-sized, rapidly growing logistics and freight forwarding company based out of Seattle. When I was hired, their network was a tangled disaster of consumer-grade routers and unencrypted spreadsheets. I personally built their entire secure digital infrastructure from the ground up. Every firewall, every encrypted database, every access log, I coded the architecture, and I knew every single digital hallway like the back of my hand. I loved my job, but there was a massive, festering tumor at the executive level of our company, and his name was Julian. Julian, 40M, was our vice president of global procurement. He was the textbook definition of a corporate golden boy. He was a charismatic, aggressively loud executive who wore custom-tailored suits, drove a brand new Porsche 911, and spent most of his Tuesday afternoons playing golf with our CEO, Richard. Julian was essentially untouchable. Because he controlled the massive vendor contracts that kept the freight moving, he acted as if the rules did not apply to him. He treated his corporate expense account like a personal piggy bank, hosting lavish client dinners at five-star steakhouses that were usually just him and his frat bro buddies getting drunk on the company dime. As the systems architect, Julian and I clashed constantly. He hated security protocols. He was constantly submitting demanding, unhinged IT tickets asking me to bypass two-factor authentication, grant him unlogged root access to the financial servers, or allow him to use unencrypted personal flash drives on the company network. Every single time, I denied his requests. I would cite strict data compliance laws and CC the CEO. Julian would back down, but he made it very clear that he viewed me as a massive thorn in his side. I was the one guy in the building who didn't buy into his charming facade, because I could see his digital footprints. I knew he was sloppy, but I didn't realize just how deep his corruption actually went. The tipping point happened in early October. Our CEO proudly announced in an all-hands meeting that a massive, international supply chain conglomerate was looking to acquire our company for a staggering amount of money. But before the ink could dry on the merger, the acquiring conglomerate was sending in an independent, ruthless forensic auditing firm to scrub our financial books clean. They were going to examine every single vendor contract, every invoice, and every wire transfer from the last 5 years. The day the audit was announced, the atmosphere in the executive suite completely shifted. But nobody reacted worse than Julian. Almost overnight, the arrogant, untouchable VP transformed into a frantic, sweating mess. He stopped leaving at 4 p.m. for golf and started staying in the office until 11 p.m. The IT help desk started getting incredibly suspicious tickets from his account. He demanded that we permanently purge a series of legacy vendor databases, claiming we needed to free up cloud storage space. When I explicitly told him in writing that deleting financial records before a federal audit was a massive compliance violation, he stormed down to the server room, his face red with rage. "I am a vice president, and you are a glorified keyboard monkey," Julian spat, pointing a shaking finger at my chest. "When I tell you to wipe a deprecated server, you wipe it. Put it in an email, CC the forensic auditors, and ask the CEO to sign off on it," I replied calmly, not moving an inch. "Until then, those drives are locked down." He glared at me with absolute, murderous hatred, turned on his heel, and stormed out. I immediately logged the interaction in my personal encrypted diary. My gut was screaming at me that Julian had been using ghost vendors, fake freight companies, to siphon company money into his own pockets, and the incoming auditors were about to expose a massive embezzlement scheme. I thought I had him backed into a corner. I thought the auditors would arrive, find the discrepancies in the databases I was protecting, and Julian would finally be led out of the building in handcuffs. I severely underestimated the lengths a desperate corporate executive will go to save his own skin, and I completely underestimated his alliance with Brenda, our toxic, fiercely protective director of human resources. On a rainy Friday afternoon, just 2 days before the external auditors were scheduled to arrive, I was sitting at my desk monitoring the network traffic. Suddenly, my primary monitor flickered. A command prompt box popped up, executing a forced script. I frowned and started typing, trying to trace the command. My keyboard was unresponsive. Connection terminated. I tried to log back into the administrative dashboard using my master credentials. Error 403, access denied. Administrator privileges revoked. My heart skipped a beat. This wasn't a glitch. Someone with an executive-level physical override had just systematically stripped my administrative access to the company's entire server network. Before I could even pick up the desk phone to call the Security Operations Center, an automated email popped into my inbox. It wasn't from the IT department. It was from HR. Subject: Urgent, Mandatory Meetings under, Brenda, Director of Human Resources. Message: you are required to report to Conference Room C immediately. Do not log out of your workstation. Do not speak to any colleagues. Marcus from Building Security is waiting outside your office to escort you. I looked up through the glass walls of my office. Marcus, the head security guard, was standing right outside my door, his arms crossed, looking incredibly uncomfortable. The trap hadn't just been set, it had been perfectly sprung. Julian wasn't going to let the auditors find the missing money. He was going to make sure that when they found the massive, gaping hole in the company's finances, the digital breadcrumbs would lead directly to the one guy who had the technical capability to hide it: me. The walk from my office to Conference Room C felt like a funeral march. Marcus, the head of Building Security, walked silently beside me. He was a massive former Marine who usually greeted me with a fist bump and a joke about the terrible breakroom coffee. Today, he wouldn't even make eye contact. The entire office floor, usually buzzing with the frantic energy of a Friday afternoon, had gone dead silent. Dozens of my colleagues peeked over their cubicle walls, their eyes wide with morbid curiosity as I was marched past them like a prisoner on death row. Conference Room C was located in the deepest, most windowless section of the Human Resources Department. It was affectionately known by the staff as the slaughterhouse. When Marcus opened the heavy door and gestured for me to enter, the air conditioning hit me like a blast from a meat freezer. Sitting at the far end of a long, white laminate table was Brenda, our Director of Human Resources. Brenda was a terrifying corporate operator. She hid behind a facade of pastel cardigans, warm smiles, and wellness initiatives, but everyone in the building knew she was the CEO's personal executioner. Her primary job was not to protect the employees, it was to protect the company's liability at all costs. Sitting next to her was a young, nervous-looking junior lawyer from our corporate counsel's office, furiously typing on a laptop. "Have a seat," Brenda said. Her voice was devoid of its usual sickly sweet customer service tone. It was flat, cold, and entirely strictly business. I sat down, my heart hammering a frantic rhythm against my ribs. "Brenda, what is going on?" My administrative access was just forcefully revoked in the middle of a network scan. "Who authorized a physical override on my terminal?" Brenda didn't answer immediately. She slowly opened a thick, red manila folder and neatly arranged 3 pieces of paper on the table in front of her. "Effective immediately, you are being placed on unpaid administrative leave pending a severe internal investigation," Brenda stated, reading from a prepared script. "Earlier this afternoon, Julian, the Vice President of Global Procurement, filed a formal whistleblower complaint against you. He brought forward undeniable digital evidence that you have been using your master administrative privileges to systematically embezzle company funds over the last 14 months. I literally laughed out loud. It was a sharp, involuntary bark of pure disbelief. "Are you out of your mind? Julian is the one embezzling. I literally have a log of IT tickets from him demanding that I delete the vendor databases right before the auditors arrive on Monday. He's panicking because he knows he's caught." Brenda didn't flinch. She slid one of the printed papers across the table. "I suggest you drop the Defensive Act. Julian brought this to our attention because he noticed discrepancies in the vendor billing cycle. When he ordered a preliminary scan of the servers, he found that over $500,000 has been funneled to 3 ghost logistics companies. And according to the server logs, the access credentials used to create those fake vendors, authorize the payments, and attempt to delete the backup drives today belong exclusively to you." I stared at the paper. It was a raw server access log. And there, plain as day, was my unique administrator ID, timestamped just 20 minutes ago, executing a mass deletion script on the financial archives. The realization hit me with the force of a freight train. Julian hadn't just panicked. He had planned this perfectly. When he realized I wasn't going to delete the servers for him, he used his executive-level physical access to our server room to trigger a forced script on my workstation. Because I was actively logged in, the system registered the commands as coming from my hands. He had hijacked my session to frame me for his crimes. "This is a hijack session," I said, my voice rising in panic. "Check the MAC addresses. Check the physical keycard swipes for the server room. Julian framed me because the forensic auditors are coming on Monday and he needs a fall guy." Brenda leaned forward, resting her elbows on the table, and clasped her hands together. The corporate mask slipped entirely, and I finally saw the ruthless fixer underneath. "Listen to me very carefully," Brenda whispered, her tone dropping to a dangerous, conspiratorial level. "The forensic auditors from the acquiring conglomerate are arriving in exactly 48 hours. If they walk into this building and find out that our vice president of global procurement has been embezzling $500,000, the multi-million-dollar acquisition falls through instantly. Our stock plummets. The board of directors gets slaughtered by the shareholders. I froze. My breath caught in my throat. She knew. Brenda wasn't stupid. She had undoubtedly looked at Julian's lavish lifestyle and the sloppy IT tickets. She knew exactly who the real thief was. But Julian was a charismatic executive whose signature was on every major freight contract keeping the company afloat. I was just the IT guy. In the cold, mathematical equation of corporate survival, I was entirely expendable. She slid a second document across the table. It was a massive packet of dense legal text. "This is a voluntary resignation and non-disclosure agreement," Brenda explained, her eyes locking onto mine. "If you sign this right now, you admit to mismanaging the server architecture and taking unauthorized severance. You resign effectively immediately. In exchange, the company agrees to quietly absorb the financial loss and we will not press federal criminal charges. We hand the auditors your confession, we show them the loophole is closed, the acquisition goes through, and everyone moves on." "You're blackmailing me," I whispered, absolutely horrified by the sheer scale of the corruption. "You want me to sign a fake confession to save Julian's skin and protect the merger. If I sign this, I'll never work in tech again. My reputation is destroyed." "If you don't sign this," the junior lawyer finally spoke up, his voice trembling slightly, "the company will hand these server logs directly to the FBI on Monday morning. We will publicly accuse you of felony wire fraud and cyberterrorism. You won't just lose your reputation. You will spend the next 10 years in a federal penitentiary, fighting a legal team funded by $1 billion conglomerate." The room was suffocating. They had me pinned against the wall. It was my word against a mountain of fabricated digital evidence backed by the unlimited resources of a terrified corporation. "I need a pen," I said quietly, looking down at the table. Brenda smiled, a cold, victorious, reptilian smile. She reached into her blazer, pulled out a silver Mont Blanc pen, and slid it across the table toward me. I picked up the pen. I looked at the signature line. I looked at Brenda's smug face. And then, I dropped the pen onto the floor. "I'm not signing a damn thing," I said, my voice eerily calm as I stood up from the table. "I want my lawyer, and I want everything you just said documented." Brenda's smile vanished instantly. Her face contorted into a mask of pure fury. "You are making the biggest mistake of your life. You have until 8 a.m. on Monday to sign that paperwork, or I am calling the police and having you dragged out of your house in handcuffs." "Turn over your company phone and your badge," the lawyer demanded nervously. I unclipped my ID badge and dropped it on top of the unsigned confession. I didn't say another word. I turned around and walked out of the slaughterhouse, escorted all the way out the front doors of the building by Marcus. I stood on the wet Seattle sidewalk, the rain soaking through my shirt. By all conventional logic, my life was completely over. They had locked me out of the building. They had revoked my administrative access. They had my digital fingerprints perfectly planted on a $500,000 crime. But as I walked toward my car, a slow, dark smile crept across my face. Brenda and Julian had made one fatal, incredibly arrogant miscalculation. They assumed that because they revoked my official network credentials, I was blind. They forgot that I was the one who built the castle. And when you build the castle, you always leave a hidden back door that the executives don't know about. The drive back to my apartment was a blur of blinding Seattle rain and pure, unadulterated adrenaline. By the time I walked through my front door and dropped my keys on the counter, the initial shock had completely worn off, replaced by a cold, calculating, and terrifying fury. Brenda and Julian had orchestrated an absolute masterclass in corporate assassination. They had successfully weaponized the company's human resources department and in-house legal counsel to back me into an impossible corner. In their arrogant minds, the trap was flawless. I was just a terrified, expendable IT guy who would spend the weekend having a nervous breakdown before crawling back on Monday morning to sign away my career, my reputation, and my freedom just to avoid a federal prison sentence. They made one catastrophic, fatal miscalculation. They assumed that because they had violently revoked my active network credentials and confiscated my physical keycard, I was completely locked out of the corporate mainframe. They forgot who built the castle. When I architected the company's server infrastructure 3 years ago, I was paranoid about massive ransomware attacks. I knew that in the event of a catastrophic cyber breach, an administrator's credentials would be the very first thing a hacker would lock out. So, I coded an absolute failsafe. I created a God mode backdoor, an undocumented, deeply encrypted ghost tunnel that didn't require an Active Directory profile to access. It bypassed the main firewall entirely because I had cleverly disguised its data packets as automated, routine firmware update pings from the building's HVAC system. Julian and Brenda didn't know it existed because it wasn't on any schematic or IT budget report. It was my digital skeleton key. I went into my home office, locked the door, and booted up my custom-built, liquid-cooled personal rig. I cracked my knuckles, opened a raw command terminal, and began typing out the intricate string of code required to wake up the ghost tunnel. My heart hammered against my ribs as the terminal screen remained black. If Julian had actually been smart enough to physically unplug the primary data drives, the connection would fail, and I would be going to jail. But Julian wasn't a tech genius, he was a lazy, panicked executive who thought clicking revoke access on a dashboard made him invincible. Suddenly, the screen flooded with green text. Connection established. Root access granted. I was in. I didn't exist on the network monitor. I was completely invisible. I didn't waste time looking at my own compromised profile. I went straight into the deep financial archives and pulled Julian's raw terminal logs. Finding the missing $500,000 took me 6 grueling hours of line-by-line code review, fueled by nothing but black coffee and pure spite. When I finally unraveled the money trail, I was actually insulted by how incredibly sloppy it was. Julian hadn't used sophisticated crypto wallets or offshore shell companies. He had simply used his executive override to force the accounting software to bypass the standard invoice verification process. He had systematically funneled the $500,000 into 3 ghost freight and logistics companies. I ran a quick public records search on the state registry for those 3 specific LLCs. All 3 companies were registered to a single residential address in Scottsdale, Arizona. A quick property tax search revealed that the house was owned by Julian's brother-in-law. It was staggeringly arrogant, a blatant, old-school embezzlement scheme disguised by nothing but his fancy job title. But proving Julian was a thief wasn't enough to save my life. I needed undeniable, bulletproof evidence that Human Resources was actively participating in a malicious, coordinated conspiracy to frame an innocent employee. I needed Brenda. I navigated out of the financial databases and slipped silently into the Human Resources secure servers. Brenda was a corporate shark, but she was incredibly ignorant about digital footprints. She genuinely believed that if an email was marked confidential, it was somehow magically protected from the server administrator. I ran a query for any communications between Julian and Brenda over the last 72 hours. The search instantly yielded a hidden, password-protected folder on Brenda's local drive titled Merger Contingency. I cracked the password in under 3 minutes. Inside the folder was the smoking gun. It was a long, frantic email chain that completely documented the collapse of their house of cards. On Wednesday night, Julian had emailed Brenda in an absolute panic, explicitly confessing that he could not balance the vendor books and that the incoming forensic auditors would absolutely find the missing funds. Brenda's response, timestamped at 2 a.m. on Thursday, made my blood run freezing cold. She had mathematically calculated the PR disaster. Her exact, written words were, "If the conglomerate auditors walk in here on Monday and see an executive-level theft, they will immediately pull the $50 million buyout offer. The board will be slaughtered. We cannot let this look like executive fraud. We need a rogue employee. We need someone with the technical access to make a cyber heist believable. Revoke the lead systems architect's administrative access on Friday afternoon. Hijack his session to delete the archives. I will have the resignation and NDA paperwork drafted to force his silence." I sat back in my chair, staring at the glowing monitor, absolutely paralyzed by the sheer, unadulterated evil of it all. They were entirely willing to destroy my entire life, ruin my future, and send me to a federal penitentiary, all just to ensure their multi-million-dollar corporate buyout went smoothly. I didn't just take a few screenshots. I initiated a mass download. I pulled the raw server data, the IP logs, the digital signatures, the hidden emails, and the physical MAC addresses of the exact machines that sent those messages. I compiled every single piece of data into an impenetrable, encrypted flash drive. Then, I fired up my heavy-duty laser printer and printed out 300 pages of physical, undeniable evidence. I organized it meticulously into thick, heavy binders. Brenda had smugly told me that I had until 8 a.m. on Monday to sign my confession. What she didn't realize was that at 8:30 a.m. on Monday, the CEO, the entire board of directors, and the senior representatives from the acquiring conglomerate were scheduled to meet in the main executive boardroom to officially kick off the forensic audit. I packed the binders and the flash drive into my leather briefcase. I wasn't going to crawl into the HR department on Monday morning. I was going to kick the doors off the executive boardroom and burn their entire corrupt empire to the ground. Monday morning arrived with a thick, heavy blanket of Seattle fog. I hadn't slept a single minute over the weekend. I was running entirely on black coffee, pure adrenaline, and the cold, mechanical precision of a man who had absolutely nothing left to lose. I put on my best tailored charcoal suit, the one I usually saved for weddings and funerals, packed the 3 heavy, evidence-stuffed binders into my leather briefcase, and drove downtown. My corporate ID badge was sitting on Brenda's desk in the HR slaughterhouse, meaning I was officially locked out of the high-rise. But as the lead systems architect who designed the building's physical access control network, I knew a fundamental security flaw that Marcus and his guards didn't. 3 years ago, during a server room emergency where I had left my badge at home, I had quietly hard-coded my personal encrypted NFC ring to act as a master override for the turnstiles and elevators. I never removed the access code. At exactly 8:25 a.m., I walked through the revolving glass doors of the lobby. I didn't look left or right. I kept my head high, walked straight past the security desk while Marcus was distracted by a delivery courier, tapped my ring against the turnstile scanner, and slid through the glass gates. I stepped into the executive elevator and hit the button for the 50th floor. The doors opened to the plush, silent executive suite. The massive, double mahogany doors of the main boardroom were closed. Inside, the quarterly stakeholder meeting and the official kickoff of the forensic audit had just begun. I checked my watch, 8:33 a.m. Perfect. I took a deep breath, grabbed the brass handles, and pushed the heavy doors wide open. The massive room was packed. Our CEO, Richard, was standing at the head of a 30-foot polished marble table, mid-sentence in his welcoming presentation. Sitting on the left side of the table were the four senior forensic auditors from the acquiring billion-dollar conglomerate, looking sharp and intimidating. On the right side sat our executive team. Julian was leaning back in his expensive leather chair, looking incredibly smug and relaxed. Brenda was sitting quietly in the corner, holding a notepad, playing the role of the dutiful HR director. When the doors slammed open, 20 pairs of eyes snapped toward me. For 2 full seconds, there was absolute, stunned silence. Then, Brenda leapt out of her chair as if she had been electrocuted. Her face turned an unnatural shade of chalk white. "What are you doing here?" she shrieked, all of her corporate composure instantly vanishing. "You are trespassing. I told security to lock you out." Julian jumped to his feet, his face flushing crimson with sudden, violent panic. "Richard, this man is an unstable, terminated employee who is currently under federal investigation for stealing company funds. We need building security up here right now. Call the police." I didn't blink. I didn't stop walking. I completely ignored both of them and strode purposefully to the head of the table. I stopped exactly halfway between Richard, my CEO, and the lead forensic auditor from the acquiring conglomerate. I opened my leather briefcase, pulled out the 3 massive binders, and dropped them onto the marble table. The heavy thud echoed like a gunshot in the silent room. I slid the first binder directly to the CEO, and the second directly to the lead auditor. "Richard," I said, my voice projecting clearly across the room, completely steady and devoid of emotion. "Before you sign that multi-million-dollar acquisition paperwork, and before these gentlemen waste weeks tearing through doctored financial servers, you need to read what is in those folders." I said, "Get security." Julian bellowed, his voice actually cracking. He started moving around the table toward me, his fists clenched. "Sit down, Julian." Richard barked. The CEO possessed a booming, authoritative voice that instantly froze the VP in his tracks. Richard looked at me, his eyes narrowed in deep confusion and anger. "You have exactly 60 seconds to explain why you just hijacked the most important meeting in this company's history." "On Friday afternoon, my administrative access was physically hijacked," I stated, looking directly at the external auditors to ensure they heard every word. Julian initiated a script from my terminal to delete the archived vendor databases. He did this because he has spent the last 14 months using his executive override to bypass accounting and funnel exactly $512,400 into 3 ghost freight companies. Julian let out a panicked, breathless laugh. "He's insane. He's lying to cover up his own tracks. The logs show his ID did it." "Page 4 of the binder," I instructed, never taking my eyes off the CEO. Richard flipped the heavy binder open. The lead auditor mirrored his movement. "You will find the raw, unedited root access server logs," I continued. "But more importantly, on page 7, you will find the public state registry records for those 3 ghost LLCs. They are all registered to a residential house in Scottsdale, Arizona. Page 8 is the property tax record for that house. It belongs to Julian's brother-in-law. The money never left the family." An audible gasp rippled through the boardroom. The lead auditor's eyes went wide as he traced the highlighted lines connecting the LLCs to Julian's family member. It was undeniable, irrefutable proof of a massive embezzlement scheme. Richard slowly looked up from the binder. His face had turned a terrifying shade of purple. He turned his gaze toward Julian, who was now sweating profusely, backing away from the table like a trapped animal. "Richard, I swear to God, he hacked that. He fabricated those documents." Julian pleaded, his voice high-pitched and desperate. "There's more," I interrupted, dropping the final nail into the coffin. I turned slowly and pointed directly at Brenda, who was frozen in the corner, looking like she was about to vomit. When Julian panicked about this audit, he went to human resources. Brenda realized that executive embezzlement would kill your $50 million buyout. So, instead of reporting the theft to you or the authorities, she orchestrated a conspiracy to frame me as a rogue hacker to protect the company's PR. "That is a defamatory lie." Brenda screamed, her voice shaking violently. I was protecting this company from you. I have the HR reports. Turn to page 22, I said softly to the CEO. Richard turned the pages. I watched his eyes scan the printed document. It was the full, time-stamped email chain between Julian and Brenda, downloaded directly from her hidden, password-protected folder. I recited Brenda's exact words from memory, letting them hang in the freezing air of the boardroom. We cannot let this look like executive fraud. We need a rogue employee. Revoke his administrative access. Hijack his session to delete the archives. I will force his silence. The silence that followed was absolute. It was the sound of a corporate empire collapsing in real time. The executives at the table were staring at Julian and Brenda with unmasked horror. The external auditors were already frantically typing on their laptops, realizing they had just been handed the easiest fraud case of their careers. Richard closed the binder. He took a long, deep breath. He didn't yell. He didn't scream. When he finally spoke, his voice was deathly quiet, which was infinitely more terrifying. Julian. Brenda, the CEO whispered, looking at them with a gaze of pure, unfiltered venom. You didn't just steal from me. You tried to destroy an innocent man's life to cover it up, and you almost cost me a $50 million merger. Richard reached out and pressed the intercom button on the center console. Marcus, the CEO ordered. Lock down the elevators. Call the Seattle Police Department, and get the FBI's white-collar crime division on the phone. Nobody leaves this floor. The 10 minutes between our CEO pressing the intercom button and the arrival of law enforcement were the most agonizing, surreal minutes of my entire professional life. The boardroom, previously a bastion of high-level corporate strategy, had devolved into a holding cell. Marcus and two other burly security guards stood directly in front of the heavy mahogany doors, their arms crossed, completely blocking any chance of escape. Julian, the previously untouchable golden boy of the executive suite, was completely unraveling in real time. He paced back and forth near the floor-to-ceiling windows, hyperventilating, his custom-tailored suit suddenly looking 3 sizes too big. He kept muttering under his breath, occasionally looking at the CEO and pleading, "Richard, we can fix this, I can pay it back, please don't do this, it's my family." Richard didn't even acknowledge his existence. The CEO stood at the head of the table, his arms crossed, his face a mask of absolute, unforgiving granite. Brenda, however, tried one last, desperate corporate maneuver. She stood up, smoothing down her skirt, and tried to walk toward the lead auditor. "Gentlemen, you have to understand, I was under extreme duress," she stammered, pointing a shaking finger at Julian. "He threatened me. He said if I didn't help him frame the IT department, he would fire me. I am a victim of executive abuse of power." "Save it for the federal prosecutor, Brenda," Richard snapped, his voice echoing like a whip. "You're the director of human resources. Your entire job was to protect this firm from liability, and instead, you engineered a criminal conspiracy that almost cost us $50 million. You are terminated. Effective immediately. For gross, malicious misconduct." Before Brenda could formulate another lie, the boardroom doors opened. 2 Seattle Police Department officers walked in, closely followed by a plainclothes detective from the Financial Crimes Division. "Julian and Brenda?" the detective asked, scanning the room before his eyes locked onto the 2 sweating executives. What followed was the single most cathartic perp walk I have ever witnessed. Julian, the man who had driven a Porsche to work and spent company money on 5-star steakhouses, dropped to his knees and openly sobbed as the cold steel handcuffs clicked around his wrists. He begged the officers to let him call his wife, crying hysterically as they hauled him to his feet. Brenda put up a fight, screaming that she knew her rights and threatening to sue the police department, which only resulted in the officers grabbing her firmly by the biceps and marching her out the door. They were paraded right through the middle of the 50th floor, in full view of the entire executive staff. Once the doors closed behind the police, a heavy, exhausted silence fell over the boardroom. The lead auditor from the acquiring conglomerate broke the silence. He closed the binder I had given him, looked at me, and let out a low whistle. "I've been doing forensic accounting for 20 years, he said, shaking his head in absolute disbelief. "I have never seen an internal systems architect bypass a force network lockout, crack an HR secure server, and deliver a perfectly packaged, bow-tied federal embezzlement case on a silver platter. You just saved us 3 months of agonizing audit work." Richard, my CEO, let out a long, ragged sigh. He walked around the massive marble table and stopped right in front of me. He looked older, tired, and deeply ashamed. "I don't even know where to begin apologizing to you," Richard said, his voice quiet and sincere. "I trusted the wrong people. I let them suspend you. I let them lock you out of the building you practically built. Your job is absolutely safe. I will triple your salary, give you full executive status, and you will have unlimited budget authority for the IT department. Whatever you want, name it. I looked at Richard. A few days ago, that offer would have been my ultimate dream. But the weekend I spent staring at the ceiling, wondering if I was going to a federal penitentiary because a corrupt HR director wanted to protect a merger, had fundamentally changed me. I realized that corporate loyalty was a myth. I appreciate the offer, Richard, I said, picking up my empty leather briefcase. But I'm not coming back to work here. Richard looked stunned. What? Why? We just cleared your name. Because my name shouldn't have needed clearing, I replied firmly. Brenda and Julian suspended me, confiscated my property, and threatened me with federal prison under the official banner of this company. They weaponized the firm's legal counsel against me. That makes the company liable for severe emotional distress, defamation, and hostile workplace environment. I pulled one final document out of my jacket pocket and handed it to him. This is the contact information for my legal representation. I am not filing a lawsuit today, because I know that would kill your merger. Instead, I am requesting a quiet, out-of-court settlement for wrongful termination and defamation, as well as the standard federal whistleblower bounty for recovering $500,000 in stolen corporate funds. Richard looked at the card, then looked at the auditors, who nodded silently. They all knew I had them completely checkmated. If I went public with the HR cover-up before the merger was signed, the deal was dead. Paying me was the cheapest, safest option they had. Have your lawyer call my office at noon, Richard said softly, accepting the card. The payout was absolutely staggering. Because I had the leverage of the pending $50 million merger, the acquiring conglomerate heavily pressured our CEO to settle immediately to make the scandal disappear. I walked away with a $1.2 million tax-free settlement, plus an NDA that ensured my reputation remained completely spotless. The aftermath for Julian and Brenda was apocalyptic. The paper trail I provided to the FBI was so incredibly thorough that neither of them even tried to take it to trial. Julian pled guilty to multiple counts of wire fraud and corporate embezzlement. He was sentenced to 7 years in a federal penitentiary and was ordered to pay full restitution, which resulted in the immediate seizure of his Porsche, his bank accounts, and his brother-in-law's house in Arizona. Brenda's fate was arguably worse for someone whose entire identity was built on corporate power. She pled guilty to conspiracy to commit fraud and extortion. While she avoided hard prison time by taking a plea deal, she was slapped with 3 years of felony probation. More importantly, she is permanently blacklisted from the human resources industry. The last I checked, she was working as an assistant manager at a discount shoe store, completely stripped of her pastel cardigans and her corporate executioner status. As for me, I used my $1.2 million settlement to launch my own independent cybersecurity and forensic IT consulting firm. I now charge Fortune 500 companies exorbitant hourly rates to come in and expose the exact same network vulnerabilities and corrupt executives that Julian and Brenda tried to exploit. I work for myself now. I set my own hours, I take long vacations, and I sleep incredibly well at night. But every time I install a new server architecture for a client, I smile, type a few hidden lines of code, and make absolutely sure I leave a ghost in the machine. Just in case.